Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's National HoUSed campaign call. We're going to give it just a minute or so to allow others to join the call, but thank you for joining early. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's call of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We're going to give it about a minute or so to allow others to join. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining today's national call of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We're just going to give it just a few more seconds and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so very much for joining today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. My name is Renee Willis, and I'm the Vice President for Field and Communications with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And I'll be facilitating today's conversation. So today, on today's call, we'll get the latest from Capitol Hill, especially related to the bold housing investments in infrastructure and spending package, and the urgent advocacy action that is needed. We'll also hear from Oliva with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and she'll provide an analysis of the rental assistance funding in the Build Back Better Act. We'll also get the latest from NLIHC's Erase project about immediate federal, state, and local actions needed to protect renters, and we'll hear from the field and much, much more. So today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll make this recording available after the broadcast. So you'll be able to find the recording at www.nlihc.org/housed. But we'll also send out an email tomorrow with links to the broadcast. And as time permits, we'll take a few questions. So if you have questions or any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of your screen. So today, we're going to go ahead and get started with Sarah Sadian, who is the VP of Policy, who will provide the latest updates from Capitol Hill, especially related to housing investments in infrastructure and spending packages, and again, the urgent advocacy action that is needed. Sarah, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So the reason why we wanted to move my part of the agenda up to the top of the call is because things are happening right now on Capitol Hill, and it is incredibly important that advocates on this call and across the country are doing everything we can to make sure that we get really robust investments in a final comprehensive Build Back Better Act infrastructure economic recovery bill. Things this week are very, very messy, though. And there's a big question that's sort of overarching this week, which is, can Democrats pull it together and get something done, or does this whole thing fall apart? Last week, you might remember that the House Financial Services Committee voted to approve their piece of the Build Back Better Act. I'm going to share a link to it in the chat box right now so we can remember what's in that bill. All of the other committees passed their bills out of their bills as well. The plan was for all of those different pieces of legislation to be put into one major spending package in the House Budget Committee so that they could have a vote on the House floor next week. That is not what is happening. What we've heard is that there's a change in plans. The House Budget Committee is not taking its steps this week, which means very likely we will not see a vote on the House floor of this larger economic recovery package. So why is there this delay? Essentially, House and Senate leaders are being forced to negotiate right now with more moderate and conservative members of the Senate, Senator Manchin and Sinema, for example, to work out their disagreements over the bill now before it comes to a vote on the House floor. Earlier this month, or maybe it was last month, but earlier this month, Speaker Pelosi had made a deal with the moderates in the House that the only bill she would bring to the House floor is a bill that can also pass in the Senate. So they're trying to work out those differences now so that ultimately anything that's brought to the House floor can pass very quickly and easily in the Senate side. So what we're going to see is that while House Financial Services Committee passes a really robust bill with all three of our priorities in it, $90 billion for rental assistance, $80 billion for public housing, $37 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, that we're now facing really significant risks that funding level will get cut. So there's two primary ways that can happen. One, we could see significant cuts to the top line spending of the bill. So we know right now the bill is about $3.5 trillion. Senator Manchin has said he only wants to spend $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion. Any cut to that top line amount puts housing investments at risk. The second way that we could see our programs get cut is if there are changes within how the committees want to allocate funds. So we were really glad to see House Financial Services Committee Chairwoman Maxine Waters working with Chairman Sherrod Brown, put together this bill that really invests in the three priorities that we have. But as members of Congress start to pipe up and want different allocations of funding, that again could put our money at risk. So for example, Senator Warner from Virginia has said that he wants more for home ownership resources through his bill. But we need to make sure that any increase to home ownership, for example, doesn't come at the expense of our housing programs. Here's why I think they're walking this very delicate tightrope between the moderates and the progressives. Like I said, things could fall apart. Right now, we're in the very messy part of legislating where it's very sort of unclear what happens now. But like I said, we're expecting a lot of ups and downs over the next couple of weeks. Here's what we're looking for. One, in addition to wanting to reduce the overall size of the package, Senator Manchin has also said he wants to wait until 2022 to get this bill passed. I think that's a non-starter. There's no way that Democrats are going to want to waste their political capital until an election year. I don't think that's going to happen, but that threat is still very real here. Likewise, we think that there's this ongoing tension between progressives and moderates, and it's unclear how that really fleshes out. So part of the agreement that Pelosi made with moderates earlier this month was that they were going to vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill at the same by September 27th. Progressives always wanted to see those two bills linked together. And so if there's a delay on the Democratic only bill, there's a big question. What happens to this bipartisan bill? Do progressives tank it like they're threatening? What does that do to the chances of everybody coming together and passing a bill at the end of the day? And lastly, there are a lot of landmines where Democrats do not agree internally on what the policy should be. So they don't agree on some tax issues. You saw a vote last week where moderates voted down a prescription drug measure. All of that is to say that everybody's sort of positioning themselves in Congress to get the maximum amount that they can get. Pelosi and Schumer are trying to thread that needle to get something done. Our job really is to make sure that any agreement that they come to provides the highest amount of funding for housing investments, and specifically provides funding for rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund at no less than the amounts that are in the House bill. So I just want to emphasize that for you guys right now. One way that you guys can help participate in this or help build that support is by keeping the pressure on Congress by joining our Twitter storm or tweet storm that we're having on September 22nd at 1 p.m. You can use the hashtag housing as infrastructure to highlight why we need these investments, and we encourage you to really drive home the message about why investments in public housing, housing trust fund, and rental assistance are really crucial and cannot be cut in any eventual deal. I think what we'll end up seeing by the time we see a bill brought to the House floor, that will be the final package. It'll be very difficult for us to make changes. And so between now and then, maybe towards the end of the month, is when we can have the most impact in making sure that we're holding on to the resources that are in the House bill. I'm going to pause there. I wanted to invite on our good friend, Ann Oliva from Center on Budget. And part of why we wanted Ann to join on is because, one, she's an expert in this, and two, because she's really good at driving home exactly what these resources mean for people on the ground. And that message, us conveying that message to Congress, is going to help us, is the most persuasive way of trying to encourage Congress to keep funding for these resources high. So Ann's going to talk a little bit about rental assistance and what that means for households. And then I'll talk a little bit about public housing and the Housing Trust Fund. I'll turn it over to you, Ann.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being on this really important call. So as Sarah mentioned, we had three priorities, or have three priorities that we've been talking about. Sarah's going to talk about increasing affordable housing supply through the Housing Trust Fund and preservation of public housing investments that were two of our priorities. The third priority, as she mentioned, is rental assistance. And really what we're talking about is affordability, increasing, ensuring that households can, who are at the lowest incomes, can afford the rents in units that are either developed through resources that are provided in this package or on the rental market. So I'm going to focus in on the $90 billion that is in the current economic recovery package with the House Financial Services Committee. And I'm going to start with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is the biggest chunk of that $90 billion. $75 billion has been set aside for the Housing Choice Voucher Program with a 5-year phase-in. That means that all of the vouchers that are included in that $75 billion would be phased in over the first 5 years and would be renewed over the second 5-year period of the 10-year total period. It means that what it includes is targeting to people with extremely low incomes. That's people who are at 30% of the area median income or lower. It has a $24 billion set aside for people who are experiencing homelessness, who are at risk of homelessness, who are survivors of domestic violence, and survivors of human trafficking. So that is the largest investment we've ever seen on homelessness, certainly in my lifetime, but that kind of investment would really be a game changer for people experiencing homelessness around this country. It also includes resources at $500 million to use to help people get into housing. So for landlord incentives or to pay for certain kinds of fees that are currently a barrier to getting housing for many people who are served through the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It includes $750 million for mobility services, as well as some additional funding for tenant protection vouchers, HUD administrative needs, and technical assistance for communities. It also allows communities to increase their cap for the number of units that can be, or vouchers that can be project-based, or the PBV part of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, so long as those units are for people experiencing homelessness or veterans, or it's for supportive housing. So that total amount of money, that $75 billion, according to our analysis, would assist 750,000 households with 1.7 million people at the end of the phase-in period. So at the end of 5 years, when we're done phasing in all those vouchers, we would be serving 750,000 households, 1.7 million people. That includes 660,000 children, 180,000 seniors, and more than 330,000 people with disabilities. I also just want to note that the $15 billion set aside for the project-based rental assistance program is also important. It would assist another 260,000 units. So that would mean housing choice vouchers are usually tenant-based. That means there's a lot of choice in where people can live. Project-based vouchers are tied to specific units or buildings. And in total, when you look at that $90 billion with both the PBRA and the housing choice vouchers, we would get a little bit more than 1 million units over at the end of the implementation period. And we also know that 71% of the people who would be assisted are people of color. So this is an incredibly important moment in our movement to serve people who are extremely low income, to serve people who are experiencing homelessness, survivors of trafficking and domestic violence, and to address historic racist practices and really lean into an equity-based implementation. We do worry that there are going to be cuts. The center will be putting out a paper probably tomorrow, but have already put out state-level data for you all to use locally with your members of Congress or other folks that you need to inform about what this impact is. I put the link in the chat. It's posted on Twitter right now, but we will be putting out a paper probably no later than tomorrow afternoon is our intent. And just to give you an idea, for every $5 billion or so dollars that are cut from that $90 billion, we are impacting over 110,000 people, most of whom are Black, and I'm sorry, the largest proportion of whom are Black, and more than 44,000 children in that group, more than 22,000 people with disabilities. So it is really important for us to do what Sarah said and try and keep those numbers as high as we can. I think with that, Sarah, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great, Anne. I just want to bring people's attention to the links that Anne shared in the chat box. Those resources, which break down how many vouchers your state would receive if this bill was enacted, that's a great resource for you to take to your members of Congress and show them what the impact would be. Right now, we're sort of in the stage where we're just talking about numbers, and they're very abstract from the lived experience of individuals and what this would mean for their lives. That's one piece of information that you can use as part of other resources too, to make the case for why we need rental assistance in this bill. So I want to thank Anne for joining with us. And I think there was a question or two. I'm going to just ask a question in place of Renee if she doesn't mind, but there's a question about whether or not the bill does anything to encourage landlords to accept vouchers. And I know there is resources for that. So I wanted you to point that out for us.
That's right. So what the bill can't do, because it's going through the reconciliation process, is to create protections against source of income discrimination. That kind of protection is included in Chairwoman Waters' Ending Homelessness Act of 2021. However, in this bill, there are $500 million set aside for communities to use to create landlord incentives or to pay different kinds of fees, so that landlords have really strong incentives to participate in the program, and that localities and public housing authorities have tools in order to implement those incentives.
Great, thanks, Anne. And then we have a couple questions asking you to restate something that you said about how many people might lose assistance if the funding got cut. Maybe you could just restate that.
Sure. So we'll be posting some of this data tomorrow. So don't feel like you're losing out on anything. But according to our analysis, as we're looking at for every $5 billion that is cut from the top line of the housing of the rental assistance line item in this package, more than 110,000 people would not have access to those vouchers. So it's a lot of people that would lose out on the ability to have safe, stable, and affordable housing.
All right, thank you so much, Anne. I hope everybody takes these resources that Center on Budget has already put out and that they'll put out tomorrow to continue their advocacy. I wanted to share a little bit more about the Housing Trust Fund resources and the public housing resources. First, I want to share with you a link in the chat box that shows you how much money your state will receive in Housing Trust Fund dollars if this bill is passed. So we know that the bill provides $37 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. Chairwoman Maxine Waters estimates that that will lead to 330,000 homes for people with the lowest incomes. This is a tool you can use, again, to go back to your member of Congress and show them what the impact would be for your state. Likewise, another thing that I think is helpful for you to share with your members of Congress as you're doing this work is more information about what their housing needs are. I'm sharing with you a link to our housing profile page. This shows you that the greatest need for housing, whatever congressional district you're looking at or state, is predominantly for extremely low-income households who are directly served with the Housing Trust Fund. So again, I hope you can take those resources and make use of them. And finally, I wanted to share with you what some research on or information about how these resources would directly address racial equity. I'm sharing again in the chat box a link to a breakdown of race and ethnicity by income level. It shows that people of color, especially Black, Native, and Latino households, are much more likely to be extremely low income and therefore more likely to be served by the Housing Trust Fund. And then finally, I want to make a little mention of the public housing dollars. There's $80 billion for public housing in this bill. That is more than enough to fully cover the $70 billion in capital backlog needs that are estimated and would help benefit 2 million current and future residents of public housing. It's hard for us to get specific state information about those public housing dollars because most of it is going to be going to the HUD secretary with the discretion to distribute those resources. But instead, I think it's really helpful for you to focus on what are the housing conditions that many public housing residents are living in, how that is unacceptable, and how those dollars would directly address it. So for example, these dollars can be used for lead, to address lead, carbon monoxide, mold, asbestos, pest infestations, boilers, roofs, other basic repairs that are needed. It's very helpful for you to be engaging with your members of Congress and sharing that information about what those resources would provide. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Renee to see if there's any questions about what's happening on Capitol Hill and what sort of resources people can be using to drive home the message with their members of Congress.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. So we do have two questions that came in, one for you, Sarah, and one for Anne. So I'll start with you, Sarah. And the question is, and I know you gave you shared a lot of great information, but someone wants to know, what can we do right now in terms of advocacy?
Okay, right now you can plan to participate in our tweet storm on the 22nd. Mark your calendars and make a plan to participate. Tag your members of Congress, share with them resources. You can encourage others in your community to participate as well. And then second, I'd say continue to engage your members of Congress. It might feel weird or awkward. Maybe you reached out to them last week or the week before. But now is really the time where you have to be very, very loud about what is needed. It doesn't benefit you to take a step back and sit this one out. We need everybody to be advocating. So if you haven't already, or even if you have, contact your members of Congress, tell them you would love their support for these 3 priorities in the bill and their help to ensure that there are no funding cuts to those programs.
Awesome. And Anne, there's a question for you. Someone wants to know, how can today's audience get access to tomorrow's report that you guys will release?
Oh, that's a great question. I certainly can send it to you all at the coalition to put out on your feed. I certainly will also tweet it out, as will the center. And if you just go to the center's website at cbpp.org and you go to housing, it should be at the top of the list tomorrow. But we'll tweet it out for sure.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you, Sarah. And again, please take a look at your chat. There's a lot of great information that's been shared with you. So take a look at those links. And we really do appreciate you, Anne and Sarah, for sharing this information. And Sarah, it sounds like now is the time that we need to continue to be very vocal, because now is the moment. So let's transition. We're going to move over to our next session. We're going to hear from field updates. And so we have with us today partners from New Mexico, California, and Nevada. And first, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who is a community organizer with Chainbreaker Collective. And they are based in New Mexico. So Kathy, I believe we have you on. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, let me start just by introducing myself. My name is Kathy, she, hers. I am a community organizer with Chainbreaker Collective, and I have been with the team for about a year, working on eviction prevention and protection. Chainbreaker is an economic justice organization that has been working in Santa Fe for about 15 years. And has really been focused on transportation and housing equity more than anything else. In the last year, because of the pandemic, we obviously got very involved in just all the things that are going on. We started by opening up a eviction prevention hotline where tenants could call us with the immediate questions. One of the things that is very notable in New Mexico is that we not only had the impacts of the federal moratorium, but we are also one of those states whose local governments also took measures to establish eviction moratoriums. Most notably, I would say IMO, in my opinion, is we have a state moratorium that was put in place by our Supreme Court, our state Supreme Court. One of the reasons that I think that's incredibly important is because it avoided the legal challenges that would have been made possible if that eviction moratorium had been put in place by the governor or by our legislature. So the fact that it was our state Supreme Court that acted to pause evictions in the state meant that we never had that kind of uncertainty here in New Mexico. By definition, what they did was constitutional. So that's really exciting, in my opinion, because I think it just shows what other states might be able to do if they have progressive courts. The other reason that I think it's really remarkable here in New Mexico is because we also had a city moratorium put in place by our mayor. Again, at the very start of the pandemic. That one is also tied to the state Supreme Court's timeline, which means, by the way, that once the federal moratorium was lifted, New Mexico remained protected because of our state moratorium. That said, what we noticed was, of course, there was a chilling effect because of the existence of the federal moratorium. I want to share some research reports that we have been working on In the last year, Chainbreaker Collective has partnered with a variety of local and national partners to write a series of 3 reports. Part 1 documented or described what the status of housing was like in Santa Fe pre-pandemic, what it was the pre-existing conditions of housing here. In our second part of the report, we also talked about what exactly eviction filings looked like during the pandemic. This was made possible by using newly available data from the courts of New Mexico. This is one of the remarkable things that's happened here in New Mexico is data has suddenly become available. Pre-pandemic, finding data of this kind was very, very challenging. So what this means is this is some of the first real analysis that has happened in New Mexico, as far as I know, using like kind of authoritative court data. That said, we were finally, the third part of our report was based on policy, based on that data, we were able to develop policy recommendations, which we also developed with our members. We are a member-based organization, so all of our decision making happens with the tenants, who we call our members. And we worked with city and other research partners, including the University of New Mexico Law School and their legal clinic program, to develop these policy recommendations. I'll focus on 2 of them that are of particular importance. In the short term, we are very dedicated to developing direct cash assistance, which could speed up the rate of rental assistance distribution. Last November and December 2020, Chainbreaker partnered with the city of Santa Fe to do exactly that. And what we were able to do was award families in Santa Fe who were at high risk of eviction, who had already received eviction notices. And we were able to get them through a very simple application process, literally about 5 or 6 questions, with only 2 documents required to upload. 1, a photo ID, and the second, a self-attestation form. Once we were able to get folks through that very simple paperwork, families received $3,000 in cash wired to their bank accounts or as a bank card. This is exactly the kind of model we would like to see the city of Santa Fe replicate, as well as cities up and down New Mexico. This, of course, is only possible if those funds, wherever their source might be, whether that's local, state, or federal, that they not be restricted or earmarked in such a way that doesn't allow for that. One of the other things that was really remarkable about the Santa Fe Direct Cash Assistance Program was that it specifically targeted communities who had not qualified for federal stimulus. We use this as an example just to say that the political will is one thing, what is politically possible is another. In our opinion, my opinion, everything is possible. It's just about flexing will. I'd love to show you folks also this article in Shelter Force, which detailed some of the work that we did in order to make that direct cash assistance possible. The second thing that I'll focus on is a more long-term solution that Chainbreaker has been focusing on, which is the development of community land trusts and tenant-owned properties. So one of the big unique things here in Santa Fe is that in the middle of our city right now, there's a 64-acre parcel of land that is city-owned. Pre-pandemic, there was some discussion of developing this in a more kind of a commercial way. What we're hoping, however, is that we can actually establish a community land trust there on that 64-acre property so that we can actually build up and develop affordable housing. In Santa Fe, this is a huge problem. As a tourist town, and I don't know if y'all have heard, but our rental market is bonkers. We are something like Tahoe, apparently. I'd love to share a couple of reports for you there. Here is a policy report from September of last year, where we detailed the feasibility of developing a community land trust on that 64-acre parcel. Recently, this has gotten a lot of traction locally. There's a lot of interest in it. And not the least of which is because there was recently a profile about the push for a community land trust in these times, talking about how these are some of the mechanisms we can use to really develop affordable housing. I'd like to pause right there because I can see that there's already a lot of questions, and I want to, give time for that. Let me see where the questions are at. Here
Great. Thank you, Kathy. So I have two questions already that came in. Number one, everyone is saying thank you, Kathy, for the information. And one question is, have Albuquerque and other New Mexico cities or counties, have they followed in the Santa Fe footsteps?
That's an interesting question. I would say kind of. Santa Fe is the capital city of New Mexico, is certainly a trendsetter. We are hopeful that if Santa Fe can pass certain things or really promotes these things, that Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Hobbs, Gallup, other cities that are also experiencing a housing crunch can, find a solution. The other thing that's really critical, though, is the market in Albuquerque is very distinct from the market in Santa Fe, distinct from the market in, let's say, Hobbs. The housing crunch manifests very differently in each of those locations, just for a variety of reasons. And so we're hopeful that our state legislature, which is part-time and will be meeting again in January, that they come up with some kind of creative solution that allows each of those locations as local cities to have more local control over what that means. Again, just because it's so very different from region to region.
Great, thank you. And here's another question. Someone wants to know, how quickly was New Mexico able to process checks or debit cards?
Okay, so let me start with that direct cash assistance from last year. So because that was through the city of Santa Fe, they partnered with local organizations that already had contacts with those communities, right? So we had already been running an eviction protection hotline. We already had a database of residents, I'll say like a list essentially of residents who had already received eviction notices or verbal threats of eviction. So when the city gave it to us, we didn't have to do any outreach, as it were, right? So from application to receipt of the money, it was a process that was taking about a week. Phenomenal. But again, it was because of the mechanism of how it was done. But I believe that by targeting the money locally to cities and counties specifically in that kind of more granular size, those folks already know where to target the funds. And that is, I think, what I would love to see at the federal level, guidance or clarity that allows cities, counties, smaller municipal governments to actually do what Santa Fe did, to work with private nonprofits like ourselves or other community organizations, again, that already know, right? Whether those are public schools or other types of organizations like that. That is also something that I think Santa Fe did really well, was really work together to build a really robust public-private partnership. And again, I know that at least I tend to be distrustful of those things. I saw it work really, really well in this case.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. What a great, just a wealth of information there. We don't have any other questions right now, but Kathy, I don't know if you can hang around. We do have questions. If you can answer those questions that come in, that would be great. Awesome. All right, so let's transition to our next speaker. Let's see if we have Brian Hanlon on the line. And Brian is the CEO of California YIMBY, and Brian will give an update about inclusionary zoning, legislation that Governor Newsom signed into law just last week. Brian, are you on the call?
I am on the call, yes. Are you able to hear and see me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Fantastic.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I was asked to speak a little bit about SB 9, SB 10, and the context, momentum, and lessons learned from those bills. So just a real quick overview. SB 9 is a bill that was authored by the head of the California State Senate, Senator Tony Atkins, which abolishes single-family home zoning in California. It permits up to 2 units per parcel, so you could now build a duplex on every single-family home parcel. And you can split those lots into 2 different lots for a possible total of up to 4 units on each lot. If you don't split the lot, you can combine SB 9 with accessory dwelling unit law and effectively build a 4-plex on that parcel. So this was, now there are a number of restrictions, like you can't do this in, ecologically sensitive and very high fire wild risk areas. It's only in urban or urbanized areas, and you cannot do this if a tenant has occupied the home for the past 3 years. So there are a number of restrictions designed to prevent any sort of displacement. There are also restrictions to make sure that it is homeowners who are taking advantage of this opportunity, and you don't invite the type of like Wall Street backed single-family home owner buying spree that some folks are concerned of. That said, look, this was widely seen as the most controversial bill of the legislature, and I would argue rightly so. California is the birth of detached single-family home zoning. By all the accounts that I can find, it was really invented in Berkeley in 1916. And I really encourage folks, if you're so curious, to read the 1915 edition of the Berkeley Civic Bulletin, where they discuss zoning. Planners didn't use euphemisms 100 years ago, quite to the same extent as they do today. They were very explicit about the rationale for these new zoning schemes. They were very clearly designed to segregate by class and race. And as we've made a tremendous amount of progress over the past 100 years on eradicating racially explicit forms of segregation, I would argue that single-family home-only zone zoning is one of the most powerful tools that segregationists have to maintain existing patterns of racial and class segregation. In terms of like the real context for this bill, it's important to note that this was part of what's seen was a Senate housing package that came out of the death of SB 50. This was the bill that California YIMBY sponsored and was authored by Senator Scott Wiener that would have gone far beyond SB 9 and would have legalized apartment buildings in areas that had access to good jobs, good schools, or that were near high quality transit throughout California, right? So this would have, fundamentally transformed the built environment of the world's 5th largest economy, ushered in millions of new homes, and it would have been really, it was a great bill, if I may say so myself. But when it died, the Senate leader announced that a package of bills would emerge from that. All of those bills died last year due to fighting between Assembly Democrats and Senate Democrats. We don't have much partisan competition here in California. And so instead of Democrats and Republicans fighting, they're Assembly Democrats and Senate Democrats fight. It's all very silly and very dumb. But fortunately this year, that sort of dynamic did not prevail, and the leadership of the Assembly and of the Senate worked closely together in order to get SB 9 passed. In terms of momentum, look, I mean, this is a bill that at the neighborhood scale, you're not going to see that much change because of the restrictions, because of the high cost of housing as it is, because this only lets you get really an additional unit beyond what ADU law already does. The UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation estimates that SB 9 could create up to 700,000 new homes statewide. But when you look at the underlying analysis, you're talking about impacts of 1% to 2% of single-family home parcels. Now, California is a big state, 40 million people live here. So at the neighborhood scale, not much is going to change. In aggregate, though, a lot of new homes will be able to be created. The important thing from my perspective is that this is a real legislative beachhead, so that we'll be able to refine and expand SB 9 in the future in order to remove some of these other impediments to home building that we had to accept really just as concessions to getting the bill passed. And with like momentum, look, it's really exciting. I mean, these are policies that were, when they were created, were explicitly grounded in racial and class exclusion. There is a very excited and energized grassroots YIMBY movement really throughout this country, but especially in coastal California. And it wasn't too hard well, it was a lot of work, but in terms of like getting them excited, it wasn't too challenging. Like in terms of like lessons learned, I think in some ways, look, it's just like basic politics, build a big like you got to like set the media narrative right. And we had a real like top-notch communications program in order to get that done. Build a big coalition and, work with folks who maybe don't agree with you on everything, and that's fine. And then incorporate the feedback that they give you into the bill so they see their own concerns in that legislation. So 2 brief examples, one that I very much supported, one that I didn't. So when many of our partner organizations are principally concerned with the welfare of Latino immigrants in Los Angeles County. And when we approached them with this bill, they said, well, look, yeah, like this sounds great, but what about our members, many of whom didn't wait for you to pass SB 9? They went ahead and just illegally split their single family home into a duplex anyways. They live oftentimes in larger, extended, multi-generational families, and they wanted more privacy. They wanted more space. So what about them? Like, can we get some amnesty provisions in this bill in order to make those homes now legal? And we said, well, that's a great idea. Yeah, and then we worked on it. We worked with them to draft legislation, to draft amendments to the bill. We got some of it in the final bill of SB 9, but we weren't able to include quite everything that they wanted. But that's the nature of politics, and I think that the bill is improved for their participation. Another big one was the California Association of Realtors. They were neutral on SB 9, but we thought we really needed their support. This was a close vote, and we needed all the help that we could get. And they really wanted to make sure that this was homeowners who would benefit from this, and that there would be owner occupancy requirements for at least one of the units for 3 years. And so I'm not a big fan of this policy. In fact, California YIMBY sponsored a bill in 2019, a successful bill to ban owner occupancy requirements for accessory dwelling units. But we needed their support. And so the pro tem took their amendments, we got them on board, and then we were able to pass that bill. So, but I would say there's a real space for making strategic enemies that can really be used to help, clarify the media message and build momentum. And so these are the NIMBYs, and fortunately, in some ways, there is a large and unfortunately growing network of homeowners who like their neighborhoods just the way they are. They don't want new neighbors. And the last thing they want is a fourplex next to their very expensive single family home. These were, quite frankly, very effective villains for us. We could talk about them, we could talk about their selfishness, and this really energized YIMBYs who are disproportionately renters, disproportionately young, disproportionately locked out of the real estate market in California. So that was quite helpful. In terms of SB 10, this was, so this also came out of the Senate housing package, came out of the death of SB 50 in the same way. But this is sort of evidence that, no good deed goes unpunished sometimes in politics. So a number of pro-housing elected officials approached Senator Scott Wiener and asked him, it's like, hey, we're going to have to upzone some of our cities in order to comply with new housing laws. We really want to be able to increase density in some of these wealthier, wider, more exclusionary areas, but they fight hard. Like they have attorneys that live there that will then come up the works for many years in litigation, and our cities can't afford to spend 4 years and several $1 million in legal fees on fighting this. And so we're like, okay, great. So we sponsored a bill that Senator Wiener authored that made it easier for cities to upzone between 3 to 10 unit buildings within their own cities. Now, to be clear, this legislation is optional for cities. If the city doesn't want to use it, they don't have to. So it doesn't directly actually change land use at all. It provides cities with a more streamlined tool for going through their own internal city processes to upzone themselves. But the NIMBYs just went after this bill. They, fought it really hard, and in part because they were driving such intense opposition to it, it drove the media conversation, and we had to fight back in equal measure. So I would argue that there are actually other bills that we sponsored this year that were more impactful than SB 10, but because of the intense opposition, we really had to fight back there. I think a lot of the lessons learned there are very similar to with SB 9. One frustrating thing, and this is always the case in politics, is sometimes there are certain interest groups that wield outsized power. Sometimes you got to beat them, sometimes you can't. And so with the NIMBYs, in our view, there is no negotiating with them. We need to out-organize, build a bigger coalition, and defeat them. But the Building Trades Union is a hugely powerful interest group in Sacramento, the most powerful organization that weighs in on housing issues in the state by far. As much as I'd love to tout the vast power of California YIMBY, I think the building trades probably got us beat there. And they were really concerned that SB 10 could undo, it could be combined with density bonus law and undo a previous deal around requiring union wages for buildings that were more than 10 units. Now, we thought these concerns were nuts because SB 10 doesn't deal with at the building level. It only deals at the planning level. So it doesn't actually streamline the buildings themselves unless if the city elects to do that, but they already have all the statutory authority they need to do that themselves if they so choose. But look, they were powerful, they were blocking things up. And so we accepted their language into the bill to prevent that from happening. We don't think the practical upshot of this is going to be very meaningful at all. But that was, one more thing where, paying attention and addressing the concerns of interest groups that have the ability to tank your agenda is very important. I'm going to stop there on SB 9 and SB 10. I'd be happy to answer any questions about those bills. I'd also be happy to answer questions about some of the other housing bills that passed in California. It was also a huge year for new funding for affordable housing, for new construction, low-income housing, for small sites acquisition, and for permanent supportive housing and various other homelessness services. The legislature appropriated, I believe, $17.3 billion just for this fiscal year, and with another $5 billion that needs to be encumbered by next fiscal year. So it was overall a very big year for housing in California.
Awesome, thank you, Brian. So we do have a question that came in. Someone wants to know what percentage of the affordable, accessible home needs in California will be met by the new zoning laws, and in what time frame? Yeah, so I think that I don't think that's really an answerable question. So California has this strange system, this housing element system, where cities need to plan where new production housing is affordable at various income levels, at a low, at very low, and moderate. Of course, funding isn't tied to this, and it's this sort of strange system where you assume that low-income people only live in new construction housing, which is very much obviously not the case. I've never lived in a new house. I've lived in older, not nice houses. And so I think that's a conceptual flaw from the get-go that new construction needs to be affordable at the onset for very low-income people. These bills will make housing broadly more affordable in the state. It will overall reduce what would have been the upward pressure on housing. And for me, most importantly, these bills really target the most exclusionary communities, these wealthier single-family home-only communities. And if you look a fourplex, or with SB 10 up to a 10plex, if you look at those prices compared to neighboring single-family homes, they are much, much more affordable. And so while I don't think it's the case that a person who makes 30% of AMI is going to be able to afford without subsidy one of these new duplexes, but that's why not all bills do all things.
And so the state of California, and I mean, California IMBY in particular, we've also championed legislation to not only increase more funding for affordable housing, but specifically to increase tenant protections as well, and to make sure that any of the new home building that we do does not displace tenants.
Fantastic. Great information, Brian. Brian, I don't know if you can stick around. We may have a few more questions to come in, and if you can answer those.
Unfortunately, I have to run, but please feel free to email me, brian@ciimb.org, and I will do my best to answer any additional questions.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today.
All right. Thank you.
Indeed. Bye. All right, and so our last field speaker today is Christine Hess. Christine is the Executive Director of Nevada Housing Coalition, and she will talk about some of the recent roundtables that they've done with affordable housing advocates and elected officials. And for the most part, these roundtables have sought to inform and influence legislators, but also to engage state officials about how to best deploy federal funding. So Christine, do we have you on?
I'm here. Thanks, Jen. Can you hear me?
Can hear you well. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. As Jen said, I'm the Executive Director for the Nevada Housing Coalition. We're a statewide nonprofit to advance and promote affordable housing for all Nevadans. Today, NLIHC asked me to speak about our recent efforts setting some housing roundtables, one of which was for our U.S. Senator Jackie Rosen while she was home. But we've also hosted a couple roundtables as part of NevadaRecovers.com for our state treasurer and governor, which has been a fantastic opportunity, which we appreciate every time the requests. I've been pondering the request from NLIHC since they asked me to talk about that, since I think this call is full of amazing experts. I just learned a ton from both Brian and Kathy, and you all probably did too. But I'm hoping that our relatively new presence in Nevada can provide some helpful tips even to you well-seasoned advocates. So as I mentioned, the Housing Coalition, relatively new, established at the end of 2018. And really bringing on full-time staff, me, in the spring of 2020, so right as COVID hit. And our leadership voice has been growing. We've been asked to convene and or facilitate quite a few housing roundtables here in the state. Really, just within the past couple months, we've convened 2 roundtables for NevadaRecovers.com with some partners, of course, always. And that's for our treasurer and governor as they have embarked on a listening session. For those of your states that have already allocated your ARPA funds, our state is actually listening, and they are sincerely listening and doing it through a series of roundtables and feedback that they're collecting. So we hosted 2 of those. I also facilitated a roundtable discussion for Congressman Horsford down in Las Vegas. I say down in Las Vegas, I'm actually housed in the northern Nevada. And then we put together a roundtable for Senator Rosen. And I guess one of the things that I think one of the reasons why we're getting these requests is not just because we're the statewide nonprofit, but especially the past 18 months, we've been working consistently and persistently, relying on some proven practices. And we are always strategic, intentional, and sincere in our work. We spend a lot of our time listening, collecting feedback, providing data and information, and sharing our feedback out directly, and moving forward with actions that match the guidance. And that also kind of piggybacks on what Brian said, right? We're incorporating the feedback we get from our stakeholders. They know that when the Nevada Housing Coalition invites them into a conversation, it's because we sincerely appreciate and need their voices. So I just kind of want to highlight a couple things around putting a roundtable together when I think about them. And I'm going to think specifically about the one I just hosted with Senator Rosen. First of all, I always think about the purpose of the roundtable. And in this case, I had 4 outcomes I hoped for. We wanted to, first and foremost, provide an open and welcoming setting for the senator to listen, and for Nevada housing stakeholders to share firsthand housing information and updates. 2, I wanted to make sure to introduce and or reinforce relationships with Nevada's key housing stakeholders and partners and the senator. She has a busy schedule, as does her staff, and really, I just found it to be an amazing opportunity, and so do my partners, and they're awesome. So I don't want the senator always reaching out to me. I mean, always, please do, Senator Rosen and all of my congressional delegates, but I am always listening and want, my congressional delegates meeting and hearing firsthand from the experts and those with boots on the ground in our state. Additionally, I wanted to make sure to express Nevada Housing Coalition support for the House campaign and all of the things Sarah talked about. Our group will be reaching out to our delegates, of course, to make sure they know the impacts in Nevada and how important it is that we need these for affordable housing. So that was an outcome I wanted as well. Definitely not the first outcome. The first outcome was to meet the needs of the senator and have the voices heard of our partners. Finally, we just wanted to reaffirm that the coalition is a trusted resource for our congressional delegates and our local elected officials in some of these other cases when they're seeking outreach and information. So we first started out with developing the agenda, identifying the necessary voices, and drafting a run a show. And I think all of these are really critical elements when you're working. In the case of the roundtable with the senator, I'm so lucky to have great relationships with her local staff. And so we worked together, and I just made sure and asked a lot of questions on what would be important for the senator to hear and how I could bring stakeholders to the table to inform her discussions and decisions around affordable housing. And I also wanted to make sure that her staff, again, could connect with some of our state's thought leaders. Our agenda focused on the past, especially right now with all of the funding that's been approved by Congress, from the CARES Act to the Consolidated Appropriations Act, American Rescue Plan Act. So we talked about the impacts those have had, the progress, but then also set us up for a future conversation. And of course, some of those might be around the housing provisions in the budget reconciliation bill. But because we set our table with diverse stakeholders, they also went into kind of the fringes of affordable housing, not always those priorities, but some of the priorities of some of the other important voices, including economic development, our private sector builders. So really bringing all those voices to the table. And I helped develop those voices at the table with my communications support team, policy development support, and of course, my board chair. Some were coalition members, some weren't. I think that's always important to note. We are not an exclusive organization, especially when it comes to voices being heard. We very much appreciate and respect all voices in the housing space. We don't always agree, but I think the one thing we can agree on is we care about our communities and our Nevadans, and so let's get there. And in my case, I'm always saying, how do we get to point B, which is affordable housing for all Nevadans? And finally, the run of show was important because I wanted to make sure that all the stakeholders that were invited knew they were invited for a specific reason, and some of the awesome things that I know they do and that I've heard them talk about and that I really wanted to make sure that they could share with the senator and potentially bring possible solutions that needed to be addressed in Congress. And again, this is true with every roundtable I set. Just last week in Las Vegas, we hosted NevadaRecovers.com listening session. And the people at that table were there for a specific reason, because they are awesome in their fields and they bring amazing ideas. And again, from the private sector to our public housing authorities to our nonprofits, really fantastic perspectives. And then the last tip I guess I would give everybody is we maintained flexibility, because ultimately we want to make sure that our elected officials, whether it's our senators, our Congress people, congressmen and women, whether it's our governor, our treasurer, our legislators, our state legislators, we want to make sure that they have the opportunities to ask their questions, and also that our partners at the table get their opportunity to connect on the topics that are also important to them and related to affordable housing. So with that, Jen, that is my roundtable conversation, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you had any. I know I learn a lot from NLIHC and all my partners when we put these things together as well.
Great, that's fantastic, Christine. Great information, great updates, and thank you so much for the tips. And that's what it's about. It's the peer sharing and sharing of information. So we really do appreciate your time. I don't see any questions just yet, but we may have some to pop in any moment. So if you can hang around. And again, we may have some questions to come in shortly. But thank you to all of our field updates for those important letting us know what's happening in your states and in your communities. So we're going to transition now. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Gallagher and Emma Foley. We're going to talk about ERA spending tracking and erase project updates. So I guess, Sarah, I have you up as being first.
I think that I will go first and then pass it to Sarah. We always keep this call on their toes. So today I'll just be providing a quick update of our ERA tracking and spending progress. NLIHC is now tracking 496 Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance programs. And our dashboard, which is pictured here, provides a current snapshot of different ERA program attributes. But I also just wanted to quickly highlight how programs have changed since opening in early 2021. As of late April, 27% of ERA programs explicitly allowed for at least one form of self-attestation instead of asking for documentation. As of today, 57% of programs explicitly allow for at least one form of self-attestation, an increase of 30 percentage points. Similarly, as of late April, only 15% of programs explicitly allowed for payments to be made directly to tenants, which has since increased to 28%. Though it's critical that these numbers continue to increase, these changes are likely due to both advocacy efforts from many of the people on this call, as well as important recent federal guidance that strongly encourages these flexibilities. Next slide. NLIHC's tracking also indicates that as of today, at least 1/3 of ERA1 funding has been spent or obligated, which is an estimated $8.4 billion. This data only includes ERA1 spending for now, but we do plan on incorporating ERA2 data in the coming weeks as soon as it is available from the Department of Treasury. And a link to both the information on ERA programs and the spending tracker is nlihc.org/ERA-dashboard. Next slide. And then this slide just shows the breakdown of spending by program type. Though it's important to note that the state value is likely the most up to date because the majority of states do now have either real-time dashboards or have regularly updated reports that they release publicly. State programs have paid or obligated about $6.3 billion of their allocation, and local programs have paid or obligated around $2 billion of their allocations. ERA programs were required to submit their monthly reports to Treasury last week, and so we do expect to have a larger spending update in the next week or so once that data becomes public. Next slide. And then last, as always, just a link to our more detailed data on spending analysis, including program level data for programs with dashboards and for state ERA programs. And lastly, if you know of any dashboards or other spending data to update us on, we're happy to include that in our tracking. And feel free to email us at research@nlihc.org. And now I'll pass it over to Sarah for our erase update.
Great, thanks so much, Emma. That was a fabulous update. So you can move on to the next slide. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Gallagher. I'm our Senior Project Director for the Erase Project, Ending Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions. And today, as you all, those of you who've been sort of with our calls every week, know that a few months ago, we had a solicitation looking for partners to work with us on the Erase project. And today I want to update you on some of that work and actually do the first of several project spotlights where we want to have some of our partners who are participating in the Erase cohort present on what they're doing and talk to you about how they're influencing their state or local emergency rental assistance program to embed some of the best practices that Emma just talked about earlier. So you can go to the next slide. So just a reminder, the Erase framework really is a national framework that is pushing ERA programs to be visible, accessible, and preventive. We really think by working in these three strategies that will really have the greatest success in getting emergency funds to those most in need, increasing housing stability, and preventing housing loss. And so just as a reminder, when we talk about visible, we're really talking about strategies that promote equitable outreach, marketing, and engagement, and efforts that really ensure that all landlords and all low-income renters know about ERA, they know how to access it, and they're able to access it through multiple sources. When we talk about accessible programs, we want to support access to and disbursement of financial support by ensuring that programs applications are streamlined, they're low barrier, they're accessible, and they meet people where they're supported to meet people where they're at. And preventive, we want to ensure that every ERA program is really looking at how to prevent housing displacement by creating formal partnerships with state and local court systems, that they're creating eviction prevention and diversion programs, and they're really supporting housing stability for the long term. So next slide. So in our process, in our ERASE cohort, we are now working with 28 ERASE cohort members, which is really exciting. It's a great group of both diversity in geography and types of organizations. It consists of statewide advocacy organizations, tenant organizing groups, and local service providers, all who are working on different strategies to advance the ERASE framework. You can see them listed here, and throughout the next few weeks and months, we hope to be having each of them come on and highlight some of their work on our national call. Next slide. Each of our cohort members are really, they're each working to advance one or more shared goals. And the way we have the cohort working together is that they're working on many shared strategies, but they're all tailoring them to meet the needs of their local context and environment in which they are working, and it really addressing the unique barriers that they may have in getting emergency rental assistance out to those most in need. And we really think this balanced approach is going to help both lift up emerging models and best practice, and then also develop a strategy for replicating those best practices and those innovations across the country. So we're very excited about the different strategies that they are implementing. So some of the shared goals that they're working on are influencing programs to accelerate the use of funds. They're doing this through convening partners, through educating program administrators, through building public and community will. They're supporting eviction prevention and diversion programs. They're standing up new eviction, diversion, and prevention programs. They're monitoring and tracking evictions. And then they're really supporting transparency through data, both administrative data as well as qualitative data through tenant and landlord stories and tenant organizing and advocacy. Some of the program specific strategies that you'll be hearing about, and then you can go to the next slide, that you'll be hearing about in the next few weeks will include expanding court watching programs in Texas, mapping evictions and hotspots in North Carolina, delivering community organizing and outreach efforts that build power of marginalized renters, particularly BIPOC women headed households in Miami who are more likely to be evicted than any other group, and then offering frontline eviction support, including legal assistance and self-help and community education to renters in that community, as well as increasing visibility of the ERA program in Louisiana by partnering with local minority-owned businesses, community-based organizations, and artists in communities like Baton Rouge, Lafayette, North Shore, and Shreveport. In Louisiana, they're specifically focusing on Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous communities that have commonly been overlooked by ERA programs, often due to lack of language appropriate materials and lack of bilingual staff. We'll also have programs like Florida talk about how they're convening 32 local ERA programs and their nonprofit partners to share best practices, ideas, administrative challenges, and really move the needle in those ERA programs. So you see there's a diversity of approaches, but many shared strategies that really are looking at how to prevent evictions, how to have that local tailorization, how to use data, and how to have really grassroots outreach and engagement in their local communities. So I'm super excited to be sharing these with you all and to sharing these lessons learned. And even more excited, I see Erin, to hand it over to Erin Kemple, who is from the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, who has the honor of being our first Erased cohort member to share some of her work with you here today. So Erin, thank you for joining, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being here, and I'm a little in awe of the people who we are in a cohort with who got this grant. So thank you very much to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and happy to share our story here today. So I call this the pandemic effect on BIPOC, which I know everybody knows about, but that was really the started us down the road of where we eventually ended up, which I will tell you about today. So we're a statewide fair housing organization whose mission is to ensure that all Connecticut residents have access to the housing of their choice, free from discrimination. And so we've been in existence since 1994 and have really focused on fair housing issues until 2008, when we saw that there was a foreclosure crisis that had hit very quickly, and that the main people who were being affected by it were people of color. And so as a result of that, we created a foreclosure prevention program to help communities of color and people of color who were being threatened with losing their homes to foreclosure. So because of that experience back in 2008, we realized very early on that the pandemic would have a disproportionate impact on BIPOC and people with disabilities. More of the people who were BIPOC in particular had more frontline jobs, so there was a higher likelihood of losing their employment. There was a higher rate of infection because of that frontline employment and because of systemic racism and access to health care. And as a result of that, they were more likely to be evicted because of the income loss, because of children being home, because of other issues that come up when families spend a lot of time in the home and not out living in the world. The other thing that we realized is that every response to every economic crisis resulted in BIPOC and people of color with disabilities losing income and wealth. So if you look, for instance, at the Great Depression, what we know for people of color and people with disabilities, it resulted in redlining. So instead of having access to any kind of lending, there were only certain neighborhoods where people of color could live in, and you couldn't buy a house there because you couldn't get a mortgage. World War II saw a housing crisis with returning veterans who had money to spend and wanted to rent and buy houses. But the GI Bill and several of the housing bills that were passed as a result of that prevented BIPOC vets from getting GI loans and also from living in most of the public housing that was built at the time. In the 1960s, we had urban renewal, which resulted in high degrees of segregation in the cities, with combining BIPOC people to cities. People with disabilities weren't even considered in any of the work that was being done at this point, because most of them were still living in institutions and there wasn't a significant deinstitutionalization effort that was affecting housing at that time. There was also urban renewal also resulted in the disinvestment in public housing, because as soon as people of color were able to access that housing, then the federal and state governments stopped investing in it. And finally, we get to the Great Recession of 2008, where BIPOC homeownership levels have sank to their lowest since the Great Depression. And so we thought, as a fair housing organization, we owed it to our clients and to our commitment to our mission to take to make an effort to really address not just the fact that people were in danger of losing their homes, but that people of color and people with disabilities were in danger of losing their homes. And so we created a four-part strategy that began with eviction prevention. And what we did is we asked our board of directors to create an eviction prevention program using funds from our reserve. So this was not money that we were able to raise. It was in June of 2020. We went to the board at that point. They allowed us to hire an attorney to handle eviction cases and a tenant organizer to respond to the issues that tenants and grassroots organizations were bringing us. The attorney began representing tenants who were physically being moved out. So in Connecticut, once an execution issues, tenants have about 24 hours to either leave or a marshal will come and move them out. We also worked with several grassroots organizations to propose and support a right to counsel legislation for everyone who was living in poverty or was low income. Education and outreach was the second prong of what we were doing. We began sending daily and then weekly updates in the form of emails to more than 6,000 people. And in that, what we now call the weekly update, we called on government to respond to specific needs that clients were bringing to us. We included information for clients and for others who were advocating for our clients about available assistance. We gave details about what the government was doing, when people should be expecting a stimulus check, whether or not unemployment was still available, executive orders that the governor had issued, information on eviction moratorium, both at the state and the federal level. And we included information from clients about what they said they needed. So it wasn't just us saying what people needed. In addition to that, we said yes to every single request from media for an interview. I think my colleagues across the state thought that maybe I had my own personal public relations person, because it seemed like I was on the local NPR stations, the statewide newspaper, the local newspapers, blogs. And it was simply because we said yes every single time we were asked. We spoke at numerous webinars and educational events on the link between systemic racism and the pandemic. And I really want to stop on that, because every time we got a call that said, well, what's happening with evictions? What's happening with people not being able to pay the rent? Our answer always was from the position that this is a racial justice issue. This is an issue of justice for people with disabilities. And by not responding to it, we are perpetuating a lot of the systemic racism that is currently keeping people of color in housing that is unsuitable, unaffordable, that they may now lose. We use social media when we co-hosted remote town halls with legislators. Technology played a big part in what we were doing. We have somebody on staff who is very good with technology, and very early, I think in April or May of 2020, we created a rent recalculation request generator, because people who live in subsidized housing have a right to have their rent recalculated if they lose income. But we found that almost no one knew that they could do this, and that the housing authorities or the subsidy providers were not responding to voice requests. They were only responding when they got something in writing, and under the regulations, that was right. They didn't have to respond to oral. We create an eviction database, so every single night, all of the eviction filings from the previous day are downloaded onto a website that only subscribers can see, and the subscribers at the moment are only our staff and legal services attorneys who are representing tenants in eviction. What it has done, it has allowed us to keep track of how many cases are being filed. We can also search for things like the issuance of an execution, so that when we put out our weekly update and we say that executions have jumped by X%, or the number of new filings has jumped, we have the data to back that up. And we used the website and social media to highlight problems with government response or the lack of response. And again, every single time we did that, we really called out the race and equity issues that were involved. We did a lot of administrative advocacy. I was asked to participate in the ESF 14 FEMA mandated committee to address housing issues. So for those of you who don't know, any entity receiving FEMA money is required to set up several different types of committees made up of community members and advocates about how the FEMA money is being used. In Connecticut, that committee is still meeting once a month. But what it did is it gave several advocates, including myself, a way to speak specifically to the people who are running the emergency rental assistance programs to request specific changes. And lest you think that that then co-opted our advocacy, during the midst of those meetings, we actually wrote an op-ed that was published in the Hartford Courant that called out the state responses promoting integration, it's promoting segregation. And I know that it was read at least by the governor's office, because we started getting many, many calls after that from people in the administration, including several people wanting to know why I would do that to them in particularly. Some of the outcomes is that the Eviction Prevention Program allowed us to link fair housing and eviction prevention, because we were able to demonstrate, not just by statistics, but by the stories we were hearing and the people that we were representing, that it really was a racial justice and a justice issue for people with disabilities. The outreach efforts have brought more attention to the effect of the pandemic on BIPOC and people with disabilities in Connecticut. And I continue to hear from people, or we continue to hear from people every week saying that it really helped them understand why eviction and the COVID-19 response is an equity issue. The really fabulous news is that as a result of the grassroots work that staff did, a right to counsel was passed by the legislature. So tenants at 80% of state median income, which is, I'm not going to remember the number. It's a little over $100,000 for a family of four, are eligible to have an attorney from the time that they get a notice to quit through the any eviction or any move out. Because of the organizing that grassroots organizations and the center did, and other legal services advocates around the state, the program has been funded at $10 million a year for 2 years with ARPA money. And we are being consulted and are participating in the design and implementation. The Eviction Database allows advocates to track the number of eviction filings, as well as specific issues like requests for execution, and plan how we're going to respond to that. Some of the changes to the emergency rental assistance program that came from the publicity, the outreach, the other work that we did, is that we asked for a better marketing program, because we think that the marketing program is not reaching people who are most in need. The average amount paid out the average rental amount paid out on rental arrearages is about $7,000. And we know from talking to tenants and from advocacy of legal services that, in fact, a lot of tenants have rental arrearages far in excess of that are just not being able to get through the system. So the outreach and the marketing that we requested didn't really happen. There has been some streamlining of application, but not as much as Treasury wants. I was very impressed with the person from New Mexico talking about 2 pieces of documents were needed, a self-attestation and a ID. Boy, would that be nice. We've gotten it down a lot, but not down to 2 pieces. We requested higher amounts, payment amounts, which was successful. It started out very low and is now at $15,000. We've asked for more money to go to housing counselors, because they're the ones who are helping people fill out applications. That has been only partially successful, and are asking that tenants get money paid to them directly through the ERA1 program, and that discussion is ongoing. So the lessons learned are that the outcomes were really the results of years of work. You know, we have staff who have gone to, you know, grassroots organizational meetings, who have done media interviews, who have worked with different groups around the state, and all of that really contributed to the work that we did. I have never been as big a supporter of our outreach as I am right now. It certainly gave us a much bigger voice. You know, I would write the weekly, I still do write the weekly update, and one of my colleagues sent it out to 6,000 people, and the work of 2 people, probably for a full day a week, gave us such a big platform that I think it really made a huge difference. We're partnering with organizations that we had never partnered with before. And I think having staff lead our response allowed us to respond quickly and effectively, because they knew better than I did what was happening to their clients or their clients' family members. But one of the things that I think happened is our staff is at capacity or over capacity, and I am getting very concerned about burning people out. With respect to our next steps, we are going to continue to try and change the ERA program in Connecticut, which is UnitedCT. We're going to work to implement the right to counsel as it was envisioned in the legislation. We're filing housing discrimination complaints against landlords who refuse to participate in the program. And we're creating a front-facing dashboard that tracks evictions by race, national origin, and gender. And I know I went over my time, but I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you, Erin. We so appreciate you and all the information and all of the great work that you and your team are doing. We will send out all of this information that we shared, from the links to the slides that Erin shared. And also, too, as I mentioned earlier, a recording of today's webinar will be available on our website. So please visit our website. You can reach us at www.nlihc.org. We'll have the recording available in the next day or so. But thank you so much for your time today. Thank you everyone for joining. We so appreciate you joining us week after week. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.